everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 27th, where I am putting some closure onto drama and beginning our poetry section. So, as you know, I asked you to look up a historical period based on one of the dramas we read, either Oedipus the King or A Midsummer Night's Dream or A Raisin in the Sun, and to find some information about that time period that would help you in terms of understanding the play a bit better, and to post that on our discussion forum. As always, you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, but you do want to read your classmates' responses. So this will give you a little bit of an idea of some of the historical backgrounds that we've covered in drama. And in terms of us moving forward, we are talking about poetry. And much like we began with short story and with drama, wanted to try to determine a definition. And there is no clear definition. And even less so with poetry than with short story, a story that's short, but ultimately we had determined that it probably deals with one particular incident. And dramas or play acting, again, there can be lots of different types, but the idea is that it's something that's performed on stage. And finally, with poetry, while there's no clear definition, we can say that it oftentimes follows particular structures, and that it oftentimes has rhyme, or it oftentimes has meter, or it oftentimes has alliteration. Rhyme being where the ending of words sound the same, alliteration where the beginnings of words sound the same, and meter being the kind of beat or pattern. And poetry tends to be rather dense and tends to be rather compact. I've talked all semester long about the importance of rereading pieces of literature, but especially with poetry. The shorter the poem is, the more likely it is that it needs to be reread multiple times because it's saying a lot in a very little bit of space. Poetry oftentimes examines emotional states. That said, we could say the same about short story and drama, but it's not easy to articulate a particular feeling like joy or love, and poetry oftentimes attempts to do that. Obviously, the Webster's dictionary definition is rather flat compared to the actual experience, and poetry tries to get us closer to the actual experience of having that emotion. So, on page 589, if you're using the textbook that I had ordered for class, or at least the edition that I had ordered for class, it gives you some suggestions for reading poetry responsively. Good news is that they're very similar to the kinds of suggestions that we have talked about with reading short story and also with reading drama. So, one of the things that is oftentimes recommended is that you read a poem out loud. I definitely recommend that as well, so that you can hear the musicality of the poem. Poetry is very much like song lyrics, but the difference is that when you are listening to a song, well, you're listening to its song and there are usually accompanying instruments. And poetry is trying to give that musicality using just the words itself. So if you can read a poem out loud so that you can hear the poem, you can oftentimes determine that sense of musicality. And also think about titles. Titles are incredibly important in all of the works that we're reading, but especially with poetry because poetry is so short. Definitely you want to think about some of the imagery and the language that's used in the poem. These are all deliberate choices by the poet. So a poet might spend months trying to come up with 4 or 5 lines. So the idea is that every word, every piece of punctuation actually has some significance. And of course, poetry is known for its visual appearance. It usually, but not always, is written with that staggered line, as opposed to prose, which is about complete sentences. And complete sentences go from one end of the margin to the other. It's what we usually write when we're writing a paper or a journal, as opposed to poetry where the line need not go to the ending of the page. And that's another decision that the poet has to make, is where are they going to end that line and why did they make that particular decision. And that's really what we're trying to uncover, is why these decisions were made, and are there additional possibilities that maybe the poet never even considered. And as always, we need to have evidence from the text in order to be able to support our position. But as long as the position is possible, it need not even necessarily be probable, then that's enough to satisfy the criteria. So in terms of thinking about how to read poetry, you want to annotate, much like we've talked about with short story and drama. Take notes, very meticulous notes. There will be a journal due at the ending of the poetry section, and it'll be very similar to the journal you did with short story and the journal that you did with drama. I'm going to ask you to select 3 poems from our poetry unit and write about a page or so response informally to each of those poems, and I will respond in turn as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I evaluate it informally, not for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Give it a check mark grade. And all of this will come to fruition with the ending of the semester, which is our final exam. And the final exam is going to be mostly devoted to poetry because we will not have enough time to write a paper number 3 on poetry. So 80 points of the final examination is going to be based on poetry. And what I'm going to do is select a handful of the poems that we've talked about in class and ask you to respond to 2 and to analyze them. In fact, there's a special word we use, explicate, E-X-P-L-I-C-A-T-E. And it looks like the word explain. Basically, that's what you're doing when you're explicating a poem. You're analyzing it or you're explaining how it works. But you're going through it word by word, piece of punctuation, sometimes by piece of punctuation. So it's a very, very, very close reading of a text. And it lends itself quite nicely to poetry. So the exam will be open book, open notes, so that you can utilize things like your journals and my responses. And if it turns out that you happen to write a journal about one of the possibilities on the final, well, then you can consider yourself fortunate. In fact, maybe not even fortunate, just the fact that you are good with preparation. Because I encourage journals with all assignments. The idea is that writing a journal in the way that we've been doing in class really helps you synthesize the course material so that when it comes to something like a final exam, you've got access to that. So in some ways, you've been preparing ahead of time in that respect. And if we were taking this final exam in class, you would have approximately 2 hours. Instead, you'll have 24 hours for the final exam. And that said, I don't expect the writing to be as neat or polished as something that you would do with a paper or even a journal. But I hope that you can synthesize the elements that we've talked about. And I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on this exam. I expect you to spend approximately 2-ish hours on the exam, as if we were meeting in person. So the best way to prepare for this exam, because the poetry section will be 80 points, 40 points per poem, I'm asking you to choose 2 poems, is to read all the poetry and watch all the videos. There will be a small section based on short story that will be worth 10 points, small section on drama that will be worth 10 points, where I will give you some shorter questions that you could answer. There'll be choice within those sections about either or about both short story and drama, and that's how we end up with our 100 points for the final examination. But in terms of thinking about poetry, there was an example that was given to you on page 596 that I wanted to read to you. Again, on page 589 is where you can have some of the suggestions about how to go about reading poetry responsively, much like you would read a drama or much like you would read a short story. And as we move forward and we start talking about the idea of how to go about reading poetry, there was one poem I wanted to read to you out loud that they use as an example of how to read poetry on page 596 that's entitled Catch. And when I have the option of offering you web links for these poems, I've done so in the notes below. Again, I don't ask too many questions about copyright. Luckily, I've been able to find just about all of the poems online, but I have not been able to find, again, because of copyright, the textbook material, which is why you want to have access to the textbook. And if you don't, remember that there's a copy online, or there's a copy on reserve in the GCC library that you can access. But this poem Catch by Robert Francis, written in 1950, reads, Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes. Interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him, as almost as possible, miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Anything, everything tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree and the long sweet cadence down. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump, in his hands. And one of the things that you could do when you are reading a poem, the first time that you read it, don't expect to understand it. You're just listening to the sound. The second time that you read it, and I suggest 3 readings, is when you try to begin to analyze it. The third time when you read it is before you're actually going to discuss the poem or write about the poem so you can refresh your memory. But one of the suggestions that the text has, and I do as well, is that you might want to paraphrase the poem. In other words, state in your own language, in sentences, what you think the poem is about, which they do for the poem Catch. The paraphrase is, a poet's relationship to a reader is similar to a game of catch. The poem, like a ball, should be pitched in a variety of ways to challenge and create interest. Boredom and predictability must be avoided if the game is to be engaging and satisfying. And while the paraphrase does a good job of summarizing the poem, it doesn't have the linguistic beauty, obviously, of the poem itself. So if we were going to go and explicate this poem, in other words, review this poem word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, I wanted to draw your attention to some elements. First, the author, Robert Francis. So we assume that probably the author is male. And if we were to look up some biographical information about the author, we would find that that's the case. And the poem was written in 1950. So since no other date is listed, we assume that we can put ourselves into the time period of the 1950s. And Robert Francis is an American author, so we can assume that we are talking about America unless we are given another set. Two boys. Let me stop at 2. The idea of 2, a couple, because this poem is about how playing a ball of catch is similar to reading poetry and writing poetry. 2 people are involved in the process of reading and writing. There's the writer and there's the reader. So 2 works very nicely in terms of trying to compare a game of catch with poetry itself. Boys. So not men. So if it were men, we would be talking about adults. So I think it's important that we're talking about children. And also, not the word children that would encompass both boys and girls, but the idea of just boys. If you think about poetry writing, and perhaps even interpreting poetry from an academic perspective, from a scholarly perspective at the university level, much like university professors and scholars do. This is very much a male-dominated profession in the 1950s. And even catch, if you think about professional baseball nowadays, is still very male-dominated. 2 boys uncoached. And this is why I think it's so important that we're talking about children, that they don't need a coach, they don't need training, they have a natural ability, are tossing a poem together. Now, certainly coaching can help someone improve their game of catch, or perhaps improve their ability to write or read a poem. That said, probably there's only so much coaching or teaching can do, because ultimately there is that sense of innate talent that someone is born with to be a professional baseball player, let's say, or to be a professional poet, or even to be a professional scholar of interpretation of poetry. 2 boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. And notice in the second line the repetition of hand. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Note how important the hand is when you're tossing a ball in a game of catch. How important the hands are when you're writing poetry, because that's how you write poetry. Even reading poetry if you are annotating and taking notes. And both are likened to a game. Catch is a game, which can be very enjoyable, but it can also be a workout and can be strenuous. And writing and reading poetry can be a game. It can be very enjoyable, but it can also be very strenuous and a workout. Teasing. That's what basically a good game of catch or a good poem is. It doesn't necessarily make it too easy for you. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. Notice how the endings of the words have very similar sounds. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. In other words, this is a workout, and the intent is not to necessarily make it easy for the participant. Whether you're playing a game of catch, you don't want to throw the ball too easily, the pitcher doesn't. And whether you are reading a piece of poetry, you probably are going to not be given the meaning immediately. You're going to have to work for it. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Maybe that's what poetry is, even though we had difficulty defining poetry. The attempt to fool. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. And maybe that's what poetry is that it's trying to outwit. Over the tree in the long, sweet cadence down. And cadence is a musicality. It's a sound. And of course, a ball in the air can whistle. And of course, poetry is known for its rhythm and its sound. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning, which is what I think we're doing with this poem. We're trying to scramble to understand what does it mean. And now, like a posy, a pretty one, plump in his hands. Notice all those P sounds. Posy, pretty, plump, which is also the same sound for poetry, that P sound. So this just gives you a very brief idea of how one could go through a poem and look at it line by line. You don't necessarily need to do it from a chronological perspective. You can do it from the top to the bottom. You can do it from the bottom to the top. You can start in the middle and do something thematically. It just depends on the poem and your preference. But as you know, we've talked about the distinction between formulaic writing that is very predictable and cliche because its primary purpose is to entertain and or to generate profit, actually both. And that's not to say that creative literature doesn't want to entertain or generate profit, but it probably is trying to make some sort of an artistic statement as well, some sort of a social statement. So there's usually more depth and complexity to literature. And I wanted to compare and contrast two poems to show you a literary poem and how that compares to a formulaic poem. And formulaic poems are found in places like greeting cards, where yes, you have rhyme and yes, you have meter, but it's very trite, very cliche, very predictable, and very generalized, so it can apply to a large audience. And the example we're given, Magic of Love, is from a greeting card. Unfortunately, I was not able to find it online, but it's on page 608, and I'll read this to you just to illustrate the distinction. And on page 608, and again on page 606 is where we have some specific suggestions for approaching poetry. Assume that you have to read it more than once. Pay attention to the title. Don't try to understand it in the first reading. Identify any words or passages you don't understand, which is important regardless of what you read, but especially with poetry because it's so short. Read the poem out loud or listen to it read by someone else. Read for punctuation. Paraphrase the poem. Try to get a sense of who is speaking and the setting, which you may or may not be given in the poem. Assume each element has a purpose, even though you may not necessarily be able to identify that purpose. Be generous. Be willing to entertain different perspectives, values, experiences. Think about a particular approach to analyzing poetry, much like we began the beginning of the semester, that some people will focus on biography or on history or on psychology, though I encourage you not to necessarily pick a particular perspective and read everything from that perspective, but read something first and then determine which perspective lends itself nicely to that. And don't expect a definitive reading, especially when it comes to poetry. But the poem, Magic of Love, which is our example of a formulaic poem that's very trite and cliche, written by Helen Ferries, and the date of the poem is unknown, and it's entitled Magic of Love. There's a wonderful gift that can give you a lift. It's a blessing from heaven above. It can comfort and bless. It can bring happiness. It's the wonderful magic of love. Like a star in the night, it can keep your faith bright. Like the sun, it can warm your hearts too. It's a gift you can give every day that you live, and when given, it comes back to you. When love lights the way, there's joy in the day, and all troubles are lighter to bear. Love is gentle and kind, and through love you will find there's an answer to your every prayer. May it never depart from your two loving hearts. May you treasure this gift from above. You will find if you do, all your dreams will come true in the wonderful magic of love. And it is very sing-song. It does have a meter, it does have a beat, and it does rhyme, but it's very predictable, it's very general, it doesn't do anything that's really unusual or creative. Again, perfect for a greeting card. As opposed to another poem about love by John Frederick Nims that was written in 1947 entitled Love Poem. And what you might notice in some of these poems is that they are divided up into sections that almost look like paragraphs. There's a word for that. It's called a stanza. Stanza, stanza. And stanzas work much like paragraphs in that a paragraph is supposed to deal with a particular topic. A stanza in a poem will also deal with a particular topic. And the poem, Love Poem, I was able to find a link for online. But I will also read you this poem. My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, have no cunning with any soft thing, except all ill-at-ease fidgeting people, the refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk, clamoring on his indolent floor. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space, and never on time. A wrench in clocks in the solar system. Only with words and people and love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, our souls on glorious spilled bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rhyme music for your sake. For should your hands drop white and empty, all the toys of the world would break. And if nothing else, this poem is going to require rereading so that you can understand some of the major elements in the poem. This is supposed to be a love poem. If I was going to explicate this poem, and I'll go through it stanza by stanza, section by section, beginning with the first section. My clumsiest dear. Now, dear is a term of endearment, which is what you would expect in a love poem, but clumsy isn't necessarily a compliment, which is somewhat confusing. This is a love poem. Why are you using a term that's not complimentary? My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases. This person doesn't just break a vase, they shipwreck, think catastrophe, think Titanic. At whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring. This is somebody that's always knocking over delicate objects like glass, so they're chipping and they're ringing. Remember, this person's clumsy. Whose palms are bulls in china. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression a bull in a china shop. The idea that something that is ungraceful is in a place with lots of graceful and delicate things. Whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen. Linen is a fabric. A burr is one of those sticky, kind of prickly plants that attach themselves onto fabric and can't be removed. And have no cunning with any soft thing. So the first stanza has basically identified that this person is clumsy and is unable to be with anything that's delicate without somehow breaking it. Except, so the second stanza begins with a contrast. So it makes sense that we would begin a second stanza because it seems like this is going to be a new topic. Except all at ease fidgeting people. This person has grace with people who are ill at ease, who are fidgeting, people who are uncomfortable. And in fact, we're told about the refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. So somebody who's coming to your house and feels socially awkward, not just socially awkward, they are called a refugee. A refugee means somebody who is homeless. So this talks about the idea of somebody who feels like there is no welcome for them. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. This person can make them feel welcome. This person's grace is with relationship, not necessarily with object. You steady the drunk clamoring on his undulant floor. I don't know if you've ever had a situation where somebody's had too much to drink in your home and you need to find a way that's graceful to get them home safely. This is something that this person can do, that they can find a way to get this person home safely and allow this person to retain their dignity. So this person's grace, again, their power is with people, not necessarily with objects. Unpredictable deer. So third stanza here. So we get a shift again. We get a term of endearment, dear again, but unpredictable, which isn't necessarily a positive thing. The taxi driver's terror. So why would taxi drivers be afraid of this person? There was a stereotype that was associated with taxi drivers. I don't know if this is still the case in the world of Uber, but that taxi drivers were crazy drivers, that they were unsafe drivers. So how horrible of a driver must you be in order to make a taxi driver anxious? And this is what this third stanza talks about. This person shrinks from far headlights, pale as a dime. In other words, if you've ever been behind somebody who is afraid to take a turn because they see a car far, far, far in the distance, let's say a left turn, and they're afraid to turn, even though there's plenty of time for them to turn. So they're overly cautious in their driving. But also they leap before red apoplectic streetcars, that they take unnecessary risks. So at the train tracks, let's say, they try to cross them when the train is actually coming. In other words, they're terrible drivers, even worse than taxi drivers. This person is a misfit in any space and never on time. Perhaps you know that person that is never able to, in one way or another, honor time. In fact, and this is the next stanza, a wrench in clocks and the solar system. Imagine how bad someone must be with time to be a wrench in clocks. They're completely distorting time. And the solar system, the universe, the time-space continuum. Only notice that with the fourth stanza, we're beginning to combine the negative with the positive. Only with words and people in love, you move at ease. In a traffic of wit, expertly maneuver. Keep us all devotion at your knees. I love the idea of traffic of wit, the traffic of language, because earlier we were talking about the traffic with driving. Lots of parallels between driving and speaking, in that there can be an accident. It can even be something that results in great pain or even death. Driving and a conversation can also be stop and go. Some are better at it than others. Sometimes you can get into a traffic jam and the conversation or the driving stops. So there's lots of parallels between the two. And that's a metaphor when you are comparing two different things without using the words like or as. It's something that we oftentimes see in poetry. In a traffic of wit, expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. That these people are so devoted to this person that they're actually kneeling in front of her. And I suspect it's a her because of the next stanza. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel. So this is a person that continually basically spills coffee or spills drinks on our flannel, on other people's clothing as well as their own. Your lipstick grinning on our coat. This is a person who leaves behind their makeup. Considering the time period, 1947, I would suggest that this is probably in reference to a female, though of course both male and female can wear lipstick. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven. So far we've been talking about all the things this person can break. But you can't break love or relationship, or at least this person doesn't. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. That spilling a drink is usually considered a negative thing, but they see it as a positive because if a drink has been spilled, that means this person is nearby because they've spilled it. And then our last stanza. Be with me, darling, early and late. Again, another term of endearment. Darling. And the idea is that it doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter with you. It doesn't matter if you're early or it doesn't matter if you're late. Smash glasses. I'll study rhyme music for your sake. That basically the sound of something breaking is musical to this person because that means that this person is nearby the subject of the poem because something has been broken. It's rhyme music, in effect. I will study rhyme music for your sake. For should your hands drop wide and empty, in other words, if this person should die, all the toys of the world would break. I love that line. Imagine the idea of all the toys in the world breaking at the same time. All of the positive associations with toys, entertainment, fun, youth. And imagine if all those toys were to break at exactly the same time. If nothing else, I think you can see that this poem, love poem, by John Frederick Nims, has a depth and a complexity that we didn't see with the wonderful magic of love. That yes, a poem can have rhyme and meter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good poem. So something like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. It has a rhyme, but it really isn't saying much. Or perhaps you might want to think back to Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream when he's talking about the raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates, which is nonsense. And it does rhyme, but he's not saying anything. And even worse, after that, he said, this is lofty. That's not, so he's full of himself. But we know Bottom's an ass. Okay. So you can scan a poem. What does that mean? That means that you can go through a poem and determine the way that it has been constructed mechanically. Much like you can diagram a sentence. I don't know if they still do this in schools, where you go through a sentence and you identify all the parts of speech into a diagram. What part is a noun and what part is a verb and what part is an adjective. The idea is that if you know the parts of speech, then you should be able to construct a sentence. I don't necessarily agree with that because I've taught grammar classes before in the past, and a student can be very skilled at diagramming or taking apart a sentence, identifying its parts of speech, yet not be able to construct their own sentences correctly. And I think there's some parallels with poetry. If you're scanning a poem, you're going through the poem and you're trying to identify how it's been constructed in terms of rhyme. Is there a pattern of words that have similar sounds? And if so, what is that pattern? And more importantly, how would that pattern be important? Or meter, is there some sort of beat or rhythm to that poem? And if so, how is that important? And again, the real piece that's important, unless you take a poetry class, and of course you'll spend time talking about scanning poetry, is determining how are these things important. So in relation to my giving two examples of scanned poems, one is on page 760 and it's called Waiting for the Storm. And again, I was able to find a link for this poem, but the link for the poem looks different than the poem in the way that it is written in our textbook, because this poem in our textbook has already been scanned, which means someone has gone through and identified things like the beat, the syllables, and also identified things like accent marks, those parts of the words that we're supposed to stress or emphasize. And if you know foreign languages, you know that many foreign languages, such as Spanish and French, actually use the accent marks in their spelling so that you know which part of the word to emphasize. English doesn't do that, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you don't necessarily have to memorize where the accent marks go, but you also don't have guides as to how to pronounce something. Take Bernardston and Bernardston, which are two locales that I always mispronounce because I'm not local. And there are no accent marks to basically help me to determine which part of the word to emphasize. Though there are some words that are under dispute. I think about Caribbean and Caribbean, or harassment or harassment. Again, you'll have some debate as to how to pronounce that. But of course, pronunciation is oftentimes regional. But nevertheless, Waiting for the Storm, if I were to read the poem without it being scanned, this is the way it would sound. It's written by Timothy Steele in 1986. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. But if I were going to read this as it reads when it's scanned, it would sound something like this. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first rain drop sounded on the hull above my head. Obviously, that's quite artificial, but you can hear that beat there, which you may or may not have been able to determine without my supplying the drums, so to speak. That said, you need to be able to identify how and why that's important, or else it's not relevant to your argument. So you need to have more than just, well, this poem has a particular beat to it or rhythm. How or why would that be important for this poem? So if we look at the context of the poem about waiting for a storm, this is about somebody who is waiting for a storm, hence the title. And that there's a breeze that sends a kind of wrinkling darkness across the bay. So this person is waiting by the water. And things are getting darker because the storm is coming. And this person, knelt beneath an upturned boat. So they're using the boat as a way to protect themselves from the upcoming storm. So they're using it as a kind of refuge. Beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder. So this is a person who's at the beach and the weather is changing. There's a transition. And notice that the second stanza is about the sand growing colder. In other words, there's a division between the first part of the storm, where the breeze is sensing wrinkling darkness, and the second part of the storm, where it looks like the storm is almost upon the person. The sand at my feet grow colder, and the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded, so now it's beginning to rain on the hull above my head. So this person, again, is beneath the upturned boat. So they've used the boat as a place of refuge. So they are actually underneath the boat as the rain is beginning. Might I suggest that the pattern, breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay I knelt, beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. That sound mimics the sound of rain, especially if one was under the hull of a boat. I don't know if any of you have ever been in the East Building when it begins to rain, but the East Building has a metal roof so that you can very clearly hear the raindrops on the roof. So one of the things this poem is doing is using its meter or using its beat in order to mimic the subject of the poem, which is about rain. So, yes, scan a poem and talk about its construction, but only if it's related to your argument. Because I could easily talk about a short story like Young Goodman Brown and say that the first sentence starts with 2 verbs and 4 pronouns and 1 noun. And my response would be, well, how and why is that important? If you can't have an argument, it's not worth discussing. However, if you wanted to argue that because there are 4 pronouns and they are all the pronoun I, and the character happens to be very self-centered, they're always talking about themselves, now we can see how the part of speech is related to the actual argument. So again, I just wanted to show you how to scan a poem, and not to necessarily think that you have to do that with poetry, but if you are going to talk about the poem's construction, then you need to talk about how and why that would be important to your analysis or your explication of the poem itself. You can also do this for rhyme, and the example we're given is a poem called Upon Julia's Clothes on page 777, but luckily I was able to find this online as well. The way you determine rhyme, you might remember this because we talked about this at the very beginning of the semester. We were talking about a sorrowful woman who was thinking about writing a sonnet, which is a kind of poem that we will talk about next class. And as she was going through it, she was wondering, should she write A-B-B-A or A-A-B-B? Basically, what she was talking about was the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern of the poem. And the way we determine that is by looking at the last word of each line. And we use letters of the alphabet to identify that particular rhyme. So the last word of the first line, that would be identified with the letter A. And any words that rhyme with A, the last word of any of the following lines, would be identified with an A. And then once we move to a new rhyme, that would be identified with a B, the next letter of the alphabet. And then again, any words that end lines that have the same rhyme as the B rhyme, that would be identified with the B. And then when you go through your poem, what you should have is a listing of all of the rhymes determined by or represented by the letters of the alphabet. And you're looking to see if there's a pattern. So A, B, B, A means the first and the fourth line rhyme together, and the two lines in the middle rhyme together. And there's lots of different patterns that you can follow and lots of names for these patterns. But I just wanted to read you Upon Julia's Close. Again, if you were going to see this online, you wouldn't see it scanned for its rhyme the way it is in our textbook, because what we've got are letters of the alphabet. This would have been added in after the poet wrote the poem. This was not from the poet, I should say, that identify the rhyme pattern. So this was written by Robert Herrick in 1648, entitled Upon Julia's Close. It's a very short poem, only 6 lines. And the poem reads out loud, "When as in silk my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me." So if we were to go through this poem and look at the last word of the first line, which is goes, that's identified by the letter A. That means any of the last words that follow in the next lines that have the same rhyme would be identified with the letter A. It just so turns out that the second line ends with the word flows, which rhymes with goes. So we have a repetition, AA. And the third line of that stanza, because there are 2 stanzas in this poem, ends with the word close, which rhymes with flows and goes. So what we have is a repetition of A, A, A. The first stanza is all 3 A's in a row. Second stanza, the last word of that line is C. C does not rhyme with goes or flows or close. So we have a new rhyme that would be represented by the next letter of the alphabet. That happens to be B. It does turn out that the next line ends with the word free, which rhymes with C. So we have a repetition of the letter B. And the last line happens to end also with a word that rhymes with C and free. The last line ends with the word me. So basically what we have is a poem that's been scanned for a rhyme scheme of AAA, BBB. And again, the response is so what, unless you can relate it to the poem. So let's talk about the poem. This is Upon Julia's Clothes. So someone is commenting about somebody named Julia in her clothing. "When as in silks my Julia goes." So this person is talking about someone named Julia who's wearing silk clothing. Then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. And silk is very liquid-like. It's very smooth. Silk is oftentimes worn as well for underwear or for nightwear. That's the first stanza. Keep this in mind for the second stanza. Next, so the next stanza is talking about the next stage. The first stage is Julia clothed in silk. "Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free." Julia's free from clothing at this point. In other words, she's nude. And I'm assuming a she because of the name Julia and the time in which this poem was written, 1648. "Oh, how that glittering taketh me." That this is even more impressive. Julia in silks was impressive, but Julia nude is even more impressive. And it makes sense that we have 2 different stanzas with 2 different kinds of rhymes. The first stanza, part A, and that basically is Julia wearing silk. And then stage B, if you will, is Julia unclothed. That's the second stanza. So this gives you an idea of how you can scan poetry for things like rhyme or things like meter or the beat. And again, I encourage you to do that, but make sure that you can come up with an argument as to how and why that's important if you're going to do that. So what we are going to do in the next few classes is read some representative poetry. And we are going to begin actually with a sonnet, which we had talked about with our short story section. That'll be a Shakespearean sonnet, which has a very strict rhyme scheme and also has a very strict meter. Perhaps Shakespeare's most famous sonnet. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And also you'll see that there are some poems that are listed as handout poems. And that means they are not included in the edition of the text that I had ordered, but you can see that I've given you those links. I'll also be giving you links next class for the poems that we're addressing that I'm able to find links for, in the event that you don't have access to the textbook. So what's left is the attendance question, which would be due Saturday at noon, 4:29, though certainly if you need an extension, let me know. Based on everything discussed today, what is your personal definition of poetry? What is your personal definition of poetry and why? As always, no right or wrong answer, and you're not required to respond to your classmates, but I do encourage you to read your classmates' responses. I'm well. I hope you're doing well, and we will continue on with poetry next class. Take care. Bye-bye.